share, and then Bernard, I give you when you get. Right.
Maybe that's not how she felt. That's how I interpreted it.
Test, test, test. Test, 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 test. Hello, hello. Hello, hello. Hello, hello. Perfect. Right. Hello, everyone. Good to see you all to reSHAPE 2025. This is, I think, the last stream of the day. So I think they saved the best for last, definitely. We have an amazing panel now. I will do quick introductions. We talk about creative clusters. So if you want to hear something else, you're in the wrong room. This is creative clusters. Yeah, I think we can make a start now. We're a bit late. I think people sort of still going, but no, all good. Okay, perfect. Right, 3 amazing panelists today. We have Professor Jane Harris. I need to read that because it's incredibly impressive. She's the director of the University of Arts of London for Fashion, Textile and Technology Institute with over 25 million investment to date. She's also director of PI for Business and Fashion, Textile, Technology. And what I find most interesting, I think she works on the intersection between textile, technology, anthropology. Yes, sort of. And I mean, this is just amazing in itself. Then we have Bernard. Bernard is a policy advisor, researcher, and writer. He's also a fellow at Cambridge. He works, he's currently the head of policy and creative industry at the Policy Evidence Center, which is co-hosted by Newcastle University and the RSA. And then third, we have Kathy, who some of you might know. We even have colleagues in the room, I think. From AHRC, she's the Associate Director for Major Programs and Cross-Council Partnerships at AHRC. She's responsible also for leading major multidisciplinary and interdisciplinary programs. And the Creative Cluster Program, I think you will hear more about it, was sort of conceived by her. And prior to joining AHRC, Kathy worked for a number of years in higher education policy and has a PhD in literature from Leeds. Perfect, right. So, creative clusters. Try to be around 40 minutes, leave enough space for questions for you guys. I think first question, maybe Jane, to you. So, talking about the Creative Cluster Program, I think it would be good to understand how it came about that you were involved with the Creative Cluster, what the Creative Cluster is, how it started, whose partner, what happened, so that the room gets a good idea of sort of, yeah, what we're talking about.
Okay, can you hear me? Thank you very much, and really lovely to be here. I'll try to make this as simple as possible because the Creative Industry Cluster Programme do present a rather novel challenge for anybody who's going to be a principal investigator in a good way. I think it really, when the call came out for the cluster programme around 2016, there were various roadshows around the UK at the time that began to talk about what the aim of the cluster programme was. And it's not, then in those days, nearly 10 years ago, it was a very, very different opportunity for universities to get their head around, truth be told. Although I have to say for University of the Arts London, where I am, it's actually very akin to how we work anyway. So the key ask was that this had to be an industry-led programme. So we had to come up with a thematic that we knew there was a gap in industry, the industry that we wanted to serve, creative industry that we wanted to serve. And I do mean serve. So this was very clearly not a slush fund for existing professors and traditional standard grant AHRC or UKRI contexts. That took quite a while for that to sink in because of the scale of the funding across the university sector. But again, for us, you know, we work in a very agile way with industry. So we knew that at UAL, that our strength was fashion, textiles and technology. That's a field we've been leading in over 30 years. There are very few designers that have come out of that exist globally that have not come out of UAL. That's not to say that we've produced all those designers, the Stella McCartneys, the Alexander McQueens, the Gallianos, and many, many more asides who are addressing the thematic area from many different perspectives. We also knew that it was a sector that was failing. And at the time, this sounds ironic, because we're now obviously very aware of the impact of the apparel and textiles or materials sector, as I would call it, globally in terms of its environmental impact. People like me have been writing about this field for over 30 years, and we've been very conscious of the sustainability issues. However, that's not how it's understood from an industry perspective. In the meantime, due to commerce, you've got things like fast fashion coming in play, and it's all about the bottom line. So I felt very strongly that what we had as a strength at UAL was the opportunity for a design-led cluster with a STEM community around that in terms of a co-I cohort. So we had a design-led co-I cohort across UAL. We're a set of different colleges of old art schools, Chelsea College of Art, Central St Martin's, Camberwell, Wimbledon, London College of Fashion. I'm sure I've missed a couple off. We have fashion and textiles in different forms, different communities of practice, different audiences, different types of consumption right across the university, and sit in several different geographies right across London. So convening that cohort was paramount. Finding the strongest co-I capability across the university was key. That gave us the design-led directive, and then each of those co-Is internal to UAL had very strong links themselves with STEM capability externally. And if you're coming from a creative sector as I do, that's a very hard one. So my predominant own field from a textile background is actually working in computer sciences. There's very few people in computer science sectors that are prepared to work with what tends to be the case, they think, are the people that just choose the colorways on the chart at the end of the day, when in fact what we're actually doing is driving a very different agenda to understanding how these kinds of disciplines, if design-led, actually would become more sustainable from the outset, for example, or be developed in terms of software quite differently from the outset and more usable for the human. So we had a very big piece of our cluster with the human at the center of it. We had anthropology links with UCL. I had anthropology links with UCL and computer sciences, for example. Our other partners included Queen Mary University, Loughborough University, and the Victoria and Albert Museum, all of which, like UAL, were looking to develop new campuses at what is now at the Queen Elizabeth Olympic Park, part of a new creative cultural quarter, which is only 1 or 2 years old, although we've been working together as a community for over 10 years now. So I was very fortunate. I had a very visionary head of college who was already investing in us developing those partnerships as a ramp up to us being at the Olympic Park as neighbours at this point in time. So we had the perfect geography that we didn't know, with a set of partners that we didn't broadly know, but we had very key established connecting points too across a whole range of STEM disciplines who were very open to us working as designers to lead them into a field that they didn't know very well, broadly the business of fashion, textiles and technology, an unwieldy title, which I've regretted to some extent until now, until the front covers of all our reports came out, and then it does what it says in the tin, which is kind of what I anticipated 6 years down the line. And then we were very committed from the outset of writing the proposal, which is our impact piece, to setting up an institute that would maintain that partnership and that R&D capability were we to be successful from the outset. Now, there was no template for this. We didn't know this was going to succeed, but we now have an institute, Fashion, Textiles and Technology Institute, which has maintained that partnership in this new geography, and we're working in exactly the way that we've become trained to do through our cluster program. So I don't know if that answers the question.
No, I think it's really good, and I want to follow up on that, because I think there are also people in the room that are probably thinking about maybe forming clusters, maybe not in the creative, but other sectors, and there's proximity, they have partners around. But just because you have proximity doesn't mean success automatically. And I guess that's the interesting bit. How did you turn proximity into successful collaboration? And probably wasn't easy to start with, I guess.
Well, we didn't have proximity because we weren't at the park. So So I explained a little bit that we have a set of co-Is internal to UAL. So I had 5 colleagues and myself who each had. So I gave everybody the geography we were working to. We were working to East Bank. We were working to the Queen Elizabeth Olympic Park. So we knew who our partners were going to be. And I sought our own internal partnership, if you like, across the university, the relationships that we have across the University of the Arts London, those that already had connecting points in some way, apparel and textiles related, with the partners that I had a list of that we were moving to the park with. And that had to have a STEM agenda. So essentially our external co-Is covered everything from sustainable manufacturing, anthropology, green chemistry, materials engineering and computer sciences. And we were the design-led component of that. So established partnerships critical. Established relationships were really key. And these were all long-established relationships. Not that everybody understood what we were trying to do, but it certainly gave us a good start in terms of the conversations we needed to build a proposal that was viable.
And did you also then sort of worked, I guess, on the vision together, or was it very clear there was a vision, everyone knew what to do, or did it also evolve over time? Because I imagine collaborations do evolve.
We worked very closely together over a 6-month period. We probably had about 8 workshops. We had a number of partners that had no idea why sustainability in fashion and textiles was so important, or why sustainability was important, period. I won't mention any names, but even in engineering context, sustainability wasn't considered of any interest or of any particular requirement at the time. The perception of the field that we're in, it was just, well, you know, this is just going to be a case of doing flashing lights and catwalks and not really understanding what actually we needed to cover to underpin this field for the future. I thought about sustainability in the title. That would have been a good call, but quite frankly, at the time, it was like saying that you were vegan at the wrong time to be vegan. Yeah. And it really was just not, I mean, it sounds awful or ludicrous at this point, 10 years on, but there was a huge risk, actually, to put sustainability in the title. And I would say 50% of our partners thought that it was a ludicrous call to drive the programme with the sustainability agenda. Sustainability for us was imperative, so we made sure that everything that we were preparing to fund, small, medium and large, in terms of a funding mechanism for R&D, had to have a circular sustainable requirement to it. So we didn't have it in the title. The business of FTT, as it's become, has to have that as an imperative, as we can now see. So, you know, then the question is that it shouldn't need to be something that's mentioned in the title. It should just be something that is. So yes, we did a lot of workshopping in order to make sure everybody understood what it was that we were going to be doing. But we also left space for ideation. So we had something like 7 work packages over the 5-6 year period we were planning for. The 7th work package was quite open in terms of we needed something. We needed a space for what we didn't know was going to come up. And so, you know, we did have it was designed to within an inch of its life, I have to say, but we did have scope to add a new direction if we needed to, even, you know, something couched that would be viable in that way.
Perfect. And I guess picking up on the vision, and I guess now we come to the funder's perspective, you must have had a vision when you launched the call. Maybe if you can tell us a bit more about sort of, I guess, the funder's perspective when you started, when you conceptualized the call, what was it you wanted to achieve, I guess, as a funder, your vision? Kathy, maybe?
No, I can do that. I can do that. I'm now on. I wasn't there. First caveat. So I joined, I started working around the clusters programme sort of pretty much at the point at which we commissioned our clusters, but I absolutely understand the kind of history of the programme. And I mean, it was an experiment for AHRC for sure. So it was a huge programme relative to then AHRC budgets and AHRC budgets now. And it was laser focused on growth. Mm-hmm. And the idea was to demonstrate that you could drive growth in the creative sector through university-led R&D. And that hadn't been done before. I mean, there are absolutely programs that sort of operated in that space before, but this was a real big bet with industrial strategy money to see if that could work. And I mean, I think... And I think there was, as Jane sort of described, there was a lot of work done at the time to sort of bring a community with that experiment, to explain that that was what we were doing, that we weren't creating a giant slush fund for folk. And once the programme was live, there was a lot of work also to evidence the impact and the benefits that the programme was having, and to work with kind of KPIs and metrics and to count things that we hadn't counted before, so that we could, as the programme started to get going, tell government and our colleagues in UKRI what we were doing and that it was working. So I know about all of that because now that we're in a position to be able to commission more clusters to run the clusters programme again, we're able to do that because we were able to say, we ran this experiment, look at all of the things that it did, look at the jobs that were created and the spin-outs that were created and the businesses that we supported, to the extent that this is now very much intended to be part of the sort of business as usual of AHRC and UKRI. And we couldn't have timed it better, really, because this is absolutely, now we have a sort of ready-made vehicle by which we can deliver against the industrial strategy ambitions. But yeah, so the distance that we've come in 10 years is sort of huge. And we've all learned a lot along the way, I think, Jane, haven't we? But what we absolutely know is this is really a mechanism that works, and we're quite excited about continuing.
And I guess a bold bet at the time. I mean, as you say, it was a significant proportion of AHRC budgets, so like really committing to it and taking the punt on it when maybe other councils weren't.
Yeah, absolutely. And the creative industries as a sector is something that is quite difficult to understand. I mean, Bernard can tell you much more about this than I can. But it was also about kind of taking an approach that was right for the sector such as it was, and in the geographies that we were funding. So, you know, the concept has to be led by the needs of a particular sector, subsector, in the place that it's operating in, and recognising that that will look different in lots of different... So not one of our clusters was easily compared to the next. You know, everybody did something quite different and in quite different ways, but that they knew would work for the spaces that they were working. So there was kind of lots of risk then in there, and lots of variety. But I think it's sort of, as a consequence, we really understand a sector that's quite complex and quite, fast-moving, well, so that we can now kind of respond to the questions that are being asked of us as a national funder.
Yep. Amazing. And I guess coming then to the point then, Bernard, to you, to actually looking and analysing what does good look like. I mean, as Kathy said, a significant investment, 100 million into the creative clusters, what came out? So what do you do if you look at that, like analysing it from the outset? What is important, what comes out? How do you do that, I guess?
Yeah, that's a great question. So, I mean, I think to maybe start off as well to kind of build on some of the points that Kathy made, that, one of the opportunities that the Creative Clusters programme offers is to harness a distinctive feature about how the creative industries organises geographically. So what that means is that you tend to see that creative businesses co-locate, they collaborate and they compete, and that derives a number of the economic benefits that we've already touched on. So things like you see increased employment, businesses in those places tend to be more productive, and you also see higher turnover in those companies as well. But that requires an ecosystem of support to make that happen. So that's part of, I think, what makes creative clusters effective. It's access to skills and talent and finance. And so you're trying to think about then, when it comes to evaluation, a range of metrics and a range of outcomes that you might be wanting to get. I mean, at the moment, certainly at the PEC, one of the things that we're thinking about are some of the bigger economic outcomes that are being looked for in the UK government's industrial strategy at the moment. So there's our big regional things like GVA, jobs created, but also I think really importantly things like increased business investment. So business investment in things like skills, research and development, which we know is relatively under within UK businesses compared to other parts of the world, and certainly in the case with creative industries. So that's a little bit of a sense of the metrics, but I think it's worth acknowledging as well there are particular challenges when it comes to data collection with the creative industries. So many of you in the room will know that we have a very high proportion of micro businesses. We rely on a very high freelance workforce. And as a consequence, what that means is that when we look at official statistics, particularly at a regional or local level, we can have quite a patchy picture of what's happening on in the creative business and workforce population. And so I think that's really an invitation, I think, with clusters programs to think, trivially, how do you embed monitoring and evaluation right from the outset of a project? Second of all, what kind of new data collection methods might you need to develop? So I think new survey instruments, making sure that there's a consistent approach across the clusters as well. But third of all, as well, thinking about that longitudinal impact. So how do you capture that impact over time? Because often it takes quite a few years for the full impact of these kinds of interventions to really bear fruit in a place, and often beyond the time frame of the immediate funding as well. So I think, it'd be interesting to think about now, even 10 years from now, how do you evaluate what's been done now, for instance, in some of the new programs?
Yeah, and I think certainly we saw that also in some of our programs is really hard long-term benefit impact. But I guess one of the idea, and I might be wrong, Kathy, but I think it was also for I guess AHRC and UKRI to look maybe beyond the traditional clusters, London, Bristol, where else can you set them up in the UK? So it would be interesting, I guess, to hear from you, but maybe also from Bernard, sort of if you looked at European places and you as well, maybe somewhere else in the world where you sort of try to get inspired for it, and what you found around the other clusters, if you can tell more maybe about that.
Yes, so one of the sort of agendas, I suppose, that we work to in the clusters funding then and now is that kind of place-based, so it's sort of spreading growth and growth opportunity right across the UK. And I think in the context of sort of how we invest now, I mean, really that could be anywhere. So, and it is about what's the case, what's the network, what's the case for investment. So, that could be an investment in London, but we're also interested in cities right across the UK. We're interested in collaborations between different sort of clusters across corridors in various different places, and also actually something that we haven't perhaps, there's certainly scope to do more work in is how that sort of R&D-led growth can reach into towns and rural areas. That's a kind of an interesting challenge because, of course, most universities are in sort of metropolitan areas. So the first to say, absolutely, that's kind of part of what we're looking to do is that kind of equitable UK-wide growth support. Now, in the international space, actually, I don't think that's something that we've explored to a sufficient extent so far. There's probably a few reasons for that. I mean, one of the things that's worth mentioning that I think Jane sort of gestured toward, but is the first round of clusters, we had COVID in the middle of that. So I think possibly, many ambitions had to be sort of altered and curtailed as a consequence of that. It's a testament to the brilliance of the people who worked on the first wave of clusters that the programme was such a success regardless. But I do think that perhaps one of the spaces that took a hit there was in kind of international collaboration and partnership, because there's lots of potential there that was probably underexploited. But I might perhaps kick to Bernard for the kind of what the opportunities with it. I'm sorry. Because I think, the PEC's been doing some really good work on kind of international opportunity and what's happening in different spaces. And I think it's probably about time we built a little bit more around that.
Yeah, so I was going to maybe answer this in kind of two kind of ways. So I think one part of your question is around what can we learn from other places with clusters. And I mean, an area that we've been exploring at the PEC has been to think about what it might mean to support creative clusters over larger geographic scales. So, we know that one of the key challenges we've got in the UK is significant regional inequality, particularly with respect to creative industries, with high concentration in London and South East, and relatively less so in pretty much all other parts of the UK. So a kind of question that we've been exploring is, well, how might you bring some of those economic benefits you get from clustering over a larger regional area to try and tackle some of that regional imbalance? And one of the models that we've been looking at is one that you see happening in places like the US and Canada, so areas with far larger geographies, also in other parts of the world as well, which is an idea called creative corridors. So in effect, what you seek to do is you seek to join up multiple, often cities or towns, through coordinated policy action. So you're deliberately stimulating greater labour mobility across those places. You're using research and development partnerships and collaborations, which tend to naturally work across larger geographic distances as well. Also thinking about taking kind of coordinated approaches to finance. And in effect, you're creating a kind of larger pool of talent, of finance, of research capacity, and supporting that over a larger area. So I think that's one area that we've been really focused on, and it's been great to see within the industrial strategy, for other parts of the economy as well, a growing interest in how corridors can be supported across the UK as well. I mean, I think the second aspect, just very briefly to touch on, is it is really worth emphasising that creative industries is very internationally oriented. I think if you think about services exports, for instance, the creative industries accounts for about 14% of all service exports in the UK. And when you start to look regionally, one of the biggest determinants of exports and one of the key kind of interests is proximity to things like universities. So I think there's a real actually interesting opportunity there to think about what might international research collaborations do to help stimulate and support that trade strategy and that trade work, particularly in a context where trade is a bit more constrained because of all the things that we know that are going on at the moment as well. So I think that's, for me, is like the two aspects of this are definitely worth exploring.
Can I come in? I mean, we were partly due to COVID, which I cannot tell you how terrified we were handing out, and not just myself as a university lead, I think right across the cluster programme. It literally landed at the very point that most of us were handing out several million to industry and wondering how on earth we were going to deliver R&D online. But we did it, and I think we all still as leads don't quite know how we managed to do that, very genuinely so. But the companies we were working with blew our socks off, and I think we were a great team as leads. That's the other thing. The AHRC did a fantastic job to sort of hold us together as leads throughout the delivery, but we all got on really, really well. And we've since gone in and got collaborative funding together, and all kinds of programs have spun out from this. We could tell you the story of clusters and bore you to death for the next few hours, or maybe not bore you to death, maybe inspire you, because I do actually think we're all very proud of what's been achieved. It's extraordinary. So don't be put off. The complexity and challenges that we faced, though, I think also is a testimony to us as creative thinkers as to how we had to get ourselves through the most extraordinary circumstances. And one of the things I would say, speaking to Bernard's point, is that we were having a conversation with the British Council, for example, who were not one of our initial main partners, but were going to be moving lock, stock and barrel to the Olympic Park. And they didn't really know much about us. I didn't really know a great deal about the British Council other than what most of us know if you read the tin. And they were really interested in this R&D delivery element, and not least because we were having to deliver it at a distance online. And after 2 years of a conversation, around 2 years into our delivery, just at a point where we were beginning to unlock again, they asked us, could we come up with a similar programme for the British Council on buttons in comparison to what we had the privilege of handing out. I mean, we roughly handed out about 4 of our 5.5 million to R&D, to companies, buying all sorts of things, machines, providing ecosystems of knowledge and research capability, etc. Very little money comes into the university. I'll just add that, by the way. So we came up with a scheme for the British Council, which we were really privileged to be in a position to provide largely in kind, because a lot of our resource was being funded by the AHRC programme. And we did a 1-year pilot, and then another 1-year pilot globally, and then a 3-year pilot, which we're just completing with India specifically. So we have something like 13 countries that we worked with, partnering UK and ODA SMEs to deliver R&D across FTTI, fashion, textiles and technology disciplines, everything from green chemistry, new materials, services, repair networks, I mean, unimaginably complex scenarios, also working with communities of practice and communities in very difficult regions who are excellent at what they do, but are very unsung in the context that we work with them, very much led by British Council initiative and capability and their expertise. So it's a huge learning curve for us and our team. We've got an exhibition on at the moment at the British Council that's been on for the last few months and is on to the end of January if you'd like to see what we produced. But it was a parallel programme that I think is, well, we know it's going to be ongoing, touching wood, but we know it's going to be ongoing. We've also brought an academic capability to the British Council in terms of how the reporting that we developed through the delivery of our cluster could be applied to an organisation like the British Council, who needs to have reports that are accessible and needs to be, able to be read by anybody involved in a programme, but equally hits high to government. So we helped the British Council articulate the impact that we had in every possible way, using graphs and charts and data, and et cetera, and it was a completely unexpected aspect of our delivery, and actually it's going to become quite a fundamental core to what we do as an institute moving forward. So, it's just one example, and there are many, many tens of examples right across the cluster programme where all, the equivalent to myself, principal investigators, we all somehow tripped over extraordinary opportunities that we ran with because we had the resource long enough to add a bit more to our team's agenda once we got used to what we were doing in order to really stretch our capability a bit further and stretch the opportunity that had been afforded us as clusters. And I think Belfast is another really good example of that, and I don't really mean to speak on behalf of another cluster where, quite frankly, they're probably the leading city in the UK. We have terrible news cycle at the moment, but what's going on regionally, nationally, Belfast being one in the field of the film industry broadly, is out the park. It's world leading, and that's not being heard, and that's in a region that's had, for obvious reasons, huge challenge. I mean, it's incredible. And then I think what the HEI does in terms of skills, etc., we realise what it is that we need to do to really regenerate the kind of pipeline to be able to continue to deliver what we've kind of, put on the map, top line.
Perfect. I would like to explore another theme, because we heard a lot about economic growth, collaboration, value creation. I think one thing I would like to explore and really understand maybe from each of you is also the idea around the skill gap, and I guess how the clusters can help bridge that skill gap that we're having in the UK, but also in Europe. And maybe the thinking behind each of you, so maybe in the conception, but if you evaluate it as well, how do you look at it? And maybe on a practical level, what have you actually done to support that? That would be interesting. I don't know who wants to start, but maybe.
That's a really good question. So, as I've said, clusters wasn't developed as a skills intervention. It can't, for example, fund doctoral training, and I think we had to be quite clear about that from the outset. Of course, what we've discovered is, you can't work in these spaces without bringing a sort of skills component in. Obviously, what we're working with is leading universities who are doing R&D, which is absolutely impacting on the curriculum. It's bringing students with you. It's kind of actually in some really interesting ways also bringing the SME community into the sort of sphere of an institution so that you're helping your business community to learn. So it's kind of, it's all over the place, right? I had a conversation earlier. There are things I think that we can do to probably integrate our sort of formal skills development offer as UKRI with the sorts of investments that we make in things like clusters, and that's a job for us really. But I think it's also a job for institutions to sort of manage their portfolio in a way that makes those connections. What I would say is, we know in the creative space, everywhere, but particularly in the creative space, there are skills challenges, and there are skills challenges that start in primary school that we can't as a funder of research and doctoral training, we can't fix all of those things. But I think what we really are interested in doing is providing opportunity that builds ecosystems in a place where all of these pieces interact and connect together, because without creative skills of various kinds, absolutely sort of technical skills, but also kind of creative thinking, the ability to imagine futures and respond to them, because my goodness, we don't know what the future is going to bring at the moment. All of that is absolutely kind of part of what our clusters have done and what we would kind of expect them to do in future. Which way shall I go, Jane?
Yeah, and I have a specific question as well, Jane, for you. What you've seen, because if I almost see it, you set the framework, but then almost said, you can do KTPs, you do commercialization, you do partnerships, you do what you want. It's your cluster, you fill it, you have a sort of remit. And I find that quite interesting. Maybe if you can talk a bit like how that related to like the skill, the knowledge exchange agenda, and yeah.
So to try and simplify it if I can, one of the gaps that we identified very early on, so we were already as a university developing a number of reports with consultants to consider how as a university we're going to be at the park. Okay, so we had already under our belt, we'd done quite extensive research, which resulted in various published reports with local government, national government, etc., as to what this subject field was going to look like in somewhere like East London. If you go back to 16th century, East London has a historical narrative in the fashion and textile field, if you think about the merchant city and the City of London and the origins of that. So, you know, there was a brilliant narrative to build on. And then think about what this move into this new region as a post-Olympic legacy was going to achieve. The real challenge, though, was that the businesses that we were looking to support were really struggling to gain access to R&D funding. So brilliant schemes, and I do mean a brilliant scheme like the Knowledge Transfer Partnership Scheme has now existed for over 40-odd years. It was about 35 when we last did some research on it, 2016. And out of something like 9,000 awards over 35 years, only about 15 had gone to broadly FTT-related areas, sectors. And I mean everything from mattresses to, you know, technology kind of apps or whatever you might want to look at. So very little funding was going towards the fashion and textile sector broadly. And that's partly because it's a very misunderstood range of sectors. And I literally do mean it does straddle quite literally. It runs from agri-tech to advertising and all the space in between. It's a massive, massive industry, global industry sector. So the other bit of information, so that was a scheme that we effectively modelled and became our core cluster delivery. So all the clusters had different methods of delivery. Some had 5K vouchers, 10K vouchers, 100K, this, that, and the next thing. We really stuck to a core method of delivering R&D, which had a KTP concept to it, which meant that you needed associates, if you like, normally post-grad if they're in a KTP true. But we knew that the industry that we were speaking with, and we did a lot of research with industry, they needed transdisciplinary, hybrid tech and material capability, physical and digital practices at high level to deal with challenges that they really didn't know where to start on. If you speak to somebody in John Lewis at the moment, for example, heading up sustainability, they've now got interdisciplinary teams in these companies that come from all walks of life, all kinds of academic provision, in order to try and deal with the challenges that we've got today. So we knew that we were not seeing students, let alone PhD students, let alone anybody at that level, evolving to a sufficient level to support industry. And I guess through the R&D, it's provided us with an evidence base to argue that case for interdisciplinary working and education at every level, really thinking, even in school, you know, how it is that the creative disciplines are not soft subjects for those that are failing. I failed miserably in school at every level trying. And I'm now working in computer science sectors and green chemistry and God only knows what else. Everybody has a moment in time and it's all different. You know, having a passion for something helps. But there's all kinds of languages that we could bring together differently in schools to generate an equitable approach to our future education needs. And I really do believe that, and I will argue that till the hilt. I think it's really, the cluster program has really engendered that across a whole range of disciplines, whether you're looking at extended reality, AI, machine learning, whatever it is. We need to really think what our educational offer in this country is for the next 50 years, and starting from grassroots, as Kathy has stated, from primary upwards. Huge opportunity to do that, but there's also huge opportunity to rethink what our higher education institutional offer is. So we, as again, consequent to moving to the park, we're developing tri-HEI at MPGR, MRes level courses, which is not easy to work across several different academic institutions with different imperatives of their working method to create novel curricula opportunities for the future. So at every level, clusters gives you, I think, an opportunity to really think what the education offer in this country and globally is, if you think of it in those terms.
No, I think it's a great answer, Bernard. Then maybe you looked at a lot of them and I guess seen what they all sort of do, but would be interesting to understand, I guess, from your point, how do clusters generally can help bridge the skill gap? We heard some very great practical things. Have you seen anything else, maybe?
So, I mean, I was just going to make a general point that, you know, innovation policy really does intersect with skills policy, right? And so when you talk to employers, one of the biggest impacts they report around skills gaps is it slows up their innovation processes, whether that's, you know, internal businesses, processes and practices, or that's, you know, external products and services that they're selling. So, you know, getting the skills gaps addressed is really key if you want to have an effective policy intervention to boost innovation in the sector. I mean, I think that at kind of place level, one of the real opportunities that clusters afford is coordination between what employers and businesses need and what training providers can provide. And I think Jane shared some really great examples of, you know, in effect, kind of bringing in the expertise from academic researchers and bringing those into very specific business contexts where you don't have that internal capacity and that skill. But I think equally as well, you know, this is a very interesting time for clusters, right? Because we've had devolution kind of running through England. So certainly in many places, new mayors and combined authorities have now got increased powers around skills. There's a new focus on new employer and kind of academic provider in place partnerships around developing local skills plans, and also growing focus on colleges, and which I think is a really important part of the story as well, the role that FE can play in this too. So I think actually that convening, coordination and alignment role actually is a really exciting opportunity, not only between university and business, but also how you bring in local government and wider education actors in a place as well.
Yeah, and I think it's almost there. A lot of opportunities. We just need to capture them, I guess. Coming to the last point, because some of you might have a lot of questions, and this is a slightly controversial one, maybe, is all about what happens if the funding ends. So sustainability and maybe that's and a lot of you might have that challenge too. It's like, you know, we come to the end of the funding. What then?
Yeah, and I think it's a lot about how you begin, right? So we are at UKRI for the most part in the business of grant funding, and grants do end, and that's not, as far as I can see on the horizon, something that that will change. And I think it's about that ecosystem point. So it's why you're doing what it is that you're doing. I regularly parrot some of the team who worked at our Cardiff cluster, who say to me, maybe quite generously, but we'd have done it anyway. So the cluster's money was great, but we had a thing to do in our region. It was in this case, it was sort of TV and film. It's what we wanted to do, and we would have done it anyway. And I think that's, you know, the best starting point for a piece of clusters work, because it's about knowing your region and addressing that need. Now, that doesn't get you follow-on funding at the end of a process, but what it does get you is the partnerships with local authorities, with businesses, with colleges, with schools, an ecosystem in a region, and an understanding of what the routes that you can then take through, right? So an option is bidding for more funding from a funding council, or building infrastructure, which actually lots of our clusters ended up doing very successfully. Or, you know, it's what does your local authority want to do with you, or what do your local small, medium, large businesses want to do? What value have you created that collectively we want to sustain? So it's a non-answer, because I'm always going to offer a bit of a non-answer. But I think what we've seen, certainly with the clusters that we've already supported, including Jane's, is if you're driven by that strong and coherent sense of purpose, there are options for what next. They will very much depend on, you know, what it is that you're looking to do.
And following on that, maybe a quick one, sort of, have you seen some of the clusters almost then taking the initiative and sustaining themselves? And Jane, I guess that's also to you, maybe a membership model, maybe they could demonstrate the value to the partners, and the industry partners picking it up. I wonder, like, how sort of the evidence behind it, I guess, or...
So every single one has sort of sustained themselves in different ways. So some it's been sort of formalised within an institution, setting up of institutes. Some it's about kind of other sources of research funding. I mean, a lot of what we do is very closely aligned to what EPSRC as a funder does, and they will pick things up. Other things are about, as I say, building infrastructure with public support and with business support. So it's a real variety. Membership model, I don't think I've seen. But yeah, I mean, an interesting proposition. Jane, shall I?
No, I mean, a payment membership model is not. I mean, we've all got our followers. I mean, I think Leeds University also led a fashion textile related cluster. You know, between us, I think we've got a community of about 10,000, you know, just in broadly, right across the sector, across UKRI provision. That's the other thing. So we straddle almost every research council, actually. And that's part of what we both, in very different complementary ways with different regions and different partners, set out to do, is to try and explain the length of breadth of this particular field. You know, screen and AI, machine learning, etc., are better known, better understood more broadly. Certainly our sector is not, and I would say it's still really challenging in that respect. In terms of sustainability, Leeds also set up an institute, got a different set of funding from the liveries, in fact, and, you know, because they've got long-standing relationships with the liveries in the UK, particularly London-based liveries. We've had various different funds. We're co-I on different things. We've got Cresca funding for different facilities. We actually bought, and this might not occur to you, so I hope you don't mind me saying this, but through our KTP type program, in inverted commas, we bought about 20 machines during COVID from international sources. I'm not even going to tell you how we got half of them into the country, for businesses, many of whom were building parts of their provision during COVID to install machines that were first of their kind, state-of-the-art facilities, that we've then developed an ongoing relationship with all of those companies, having developed our own STEM capability now in-house at UAL. So we've got a network of machine capability with academic expertise, another level of the ecosystem evolving so that other companies can access that R&D opportunity. So we've got that much leverage from the companies that we worked with, that they want to work with other companies and help them. I mean, that to me is the next bit of the narrative that we're evolving as part of the, you know, the institute future, which is just phenomenal. And there's no point in all that equipment sitting in a university. It really begs the question why universities get all the equipment. They should have some of the equipment, not all the equipment. So that ecosystem is going to be really fascinating to see. And obviously our partnership with the British Council, etc. So everybody has evolved a future, but with a different model.
Okay, that's really interesting. Right, I think I would like to open up the floor to all of you. Questions? I don't know if there's someone with a microphone running around. Otherwise, I might run around with a microphone. I think we have all the microphones. I don't know. Show of hands. Who has a question?
Hi, thank you for your talk. I was wondering, sort of maybe a boring question in some ways, but how does IP work in a cluster context? Sorry.
It's a very important question, and So all the IP, if we were supporting R&D in any way, sits with the companies, generally speaking, and that was really something that we decided. Certainly, I think all the clusters ran with that as a model. You know, and the idea is that obviously us as academics, we're benefiting from the publishing or the related product or whatever our practice or theoretical intervention was in the context of the delivery of the R&D. But the idea is that it's industry-led. We're funding industry in small, medium, larger KTP type way in some form. I think nearly all the programs kind of look like that nationally in some way, regardless of the funds received. And the IP sat with the companies. Otherwise, how on earth would it continue to evolve? We can't trap it in a university. That's not the point. So, yeah.
Yeah, just to add that we should probably recognise the lengths and efforts that the clusters teams went to in order to get themselves into that position. So I think that we did ask teams to, don't tell anybody, break some university processes to sort of make what they did work from an IP perspective, because it's not easy. Bernard, do you want to say anything about it?
You definitely need good legal departments.
And from own experience, I can say as a TTO, it's a nightmare. So it's the best I always advised, obviously you never heard me saying that, it's like, just go away and do it and don't tell us.
One or two people have said that to me in the past.
Anyone else? Any other questions in the room? I don't know. Yeah.
It's less a question and more a prompt, I suppose. I was wondering if I could prompt you a little more on this idea of the corridor. I come from Cambridge, and we are in an Oxford and Cambridge arc. We are the corner of a triangle between London, Oxford and Cambridge. We are corridored with Norwich, and I don't know what we are with Manchester, but it kind of jumps over most of the country. So I guess what I'm asking for is, how does a corridor fit into, and I'm sure all higher education institutions exist in these overlapping geographies. So how does a corridor exist in that space? And how do you make it look unique, and how do you make it work?
Yeah, that's a really good question. And I would say as well that it's a new area, and there are a number of initiatives happening across the country, and we're really keen to see how they play out, and the challenges and the geographies are all different. So one initiative that we've been supporting where we can at the PEC is something called One Creative North, which is effectively a partnership between, I think it's 6 mayoral combined authorities across the north of England, looking at taking a coordinated approach to some aspects of their creative industries policy. I think a couple of general things to say. One is you've got to think about what's the additionality. So what will joining up with these other actors over a larger area do that doesn't simply duplicate what's already in place or even compete and crowd out what's already in place? And I think that can only be really worked through in a kind of bottom-up way. I think the second thing is, we need to recognize that the sector is incredibly networked, incredibly connected, right? So we've been doing a lot of work up in the north of England, again, in the context of that corridor work. One of the things that we often hear is London remains a really important node in the network, right? For companies, for universities, for creative practitioners based across the country. So in effect as well, I think the other thing to say is that when we're talking about things like corridors or clusters, it's not about creating a kind of closed geography and a closed loop. It's about augmenting an ecosystem in a place and thereby also strengthening connections outside of it as well. So I think that's the other thing that I would emphasize is its additionality and the network effects. I don't know if anyone else wants to add anything.
That was very well put.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Anyone else? Yep.
Thank you for a really, really fascinating discussion. I wonder if you could highlight maybe top 3 examples of where you've seen real economic growth potential from this investment. I'm asking from a position of pain to a certain extent. I work with the British Antarctic Survey, and we've got lovely collaborations with artists in sort of cottage industries mostly, with beautiful products that come out of it where we make our images, knowledge assets available. But nothing of that has scaled. And therefore, it makes it really difficult for me to make the case to our executive team to say we need to keep investing in this area, because at the moment, as we all know, everything is about demonstrating there's economic growth. I wonder if you can give a flavor of where you see, have evidence of the biggest potential.
Do you want to start with that? I feel like
I mean, you know, at the end of the day, the ask is clear. It is really difficult if you're within a community where there's wonderful things happening, but they're not necessarily generating the kind of economic growth that you're wanting to see. And you can't, you know, for this program, you can't conjure that up. I mean, at the end of the day, you know, I think our leverage was something like 23 million out of a 6 million, £5.5–6 million investment. It's a case that you have to find, but it's not necessarily in the most obvious form. So I think the other thing to really consider is that you've got you've got clusters, and you've got to really look at what's already been funded, what creative industries have been funded, what creative industries haven't been funded, and what do we understand the scope of creative industry to be. So, for example, you might think, well, the museum sector, but what about all the companies that intersect with the museum sector? You know, how does that community come together? How is that convened? You know, the creation of a geography and a cluster and a set of creative industries is as creative as as much a part of the creative process as it is to identify something very obvious and specific. I think that's where, as organisations, as HEI organisations, it's really worth consulting across with your colleagues to understand broadly what people are, you know, what your colleagues are engaging with in order to understand where the strengths in your organisation are. You've still got to be able to support the ask. The ask is going to come to you from industry for things that you might never have envisaged. You know, to us, it was machines and skills and services that we didn't know we could respond well to, for example. You know, it's about opening up a box of possibility to a cluster that you create, but it does have to have a strong evidence base for a future economic growth agenda, and that's not difficult to, you know, you have to really address that.
And I also wonder, maybe Kathy, but also Bernard, like about maybe the evidence model, I imagine is quite important. So what do you actually measure? What do you collect as data, I imagine?
Yeah, so what I was going to say, I think that's absolutely right. And there is an element of serendipity in all of this. I think putting people together is really valuable. So bringing in technologists to talk to creatives, as Jane's teams did, I think is where you kind of find some of that. There are... I think each of the clusters that we supported in the first round produced their own sort of impact reporting, and we've done sort of aggregate pulling together. So it's worth a look at that, because what they'll show you is this: here is this company and it was doing this, and these are the connections it makes. So some of those pathways through, they'll also show you about the sort of impact measures that we were looking for. So that's worth kind of unpicking, because then you can see some of the models that for the sectors in which we were working and the places in which we were working kind of succeeded. Bernard, shall I?
I mean, this is maybe a partial answer to the question, but I mean, I was just sort of thinking, you know, one place to start with things like this is thinking about where you can already see evidence that there is clustering starting to happen, and where you can then augment it through these kinds of interventions. And I think something we haven't really spoken about a lot today has been how you show that around smaller clusters, so kind of smaller towns, smaller places. And it's something that PEC has done a lot of work on over the last few years, and what that's required us to do is to do things like use novel data sources. So we've used web scrape data to map around 700 kind of microclusters. These are kind of smaller towns, villages, or streets where you can see some of these clustering effects. And then to do business surveys with companies that we've identified in those places. So we ran between, I think it was around 2020 and 2022, a kind of 3-wave longitudinal business survey of creative businesses in those microclusters, many of which were in rural and coastal areas, for instance, where you do have those scale-up issues a bit more persistent. But that's been really crucial. So I think, again, it goes back to that earlier point, you know, thinking early, what evidence have you got about a place in terms of its potential, and where necessarily looking outside of those official statistics. And then B, just baking in right from the outset of a project how you're going to track over time the impact of those interventions through a new survey or other data collection methods.
Can I just add something very briefly? I mean, I think to bear in mind that nearly all the businesses we supported were micro businesses, and they don't necessarily know what it is that they could develop alongside what you're, so it might be that you think that your companies that you're talking about in the region that you're in are knitting socks or whatever, but what do robotics, AI, machine learning, global capability, global opportunities, business support, what does that offer them? And I think going back to what we created, it was a very compelling offer to businesses that wouldn't normally think of accessing those kinds of technology opportunities, and then the academic and business and so on support wrap around to access that. So I think, I wouldn't just judge the book by the cover in terms of the businesses that you're working with. I'd think about, is it useful to start workshopping with those businesses to think about what if? And you might be very surprised as to the level of growth and reach that each one of them might actually imply that they're interested in looking to, if given the right opportunity and given the right, even having an inkling of what you offer as HEIs. Most of them had no idea of what we could offer as an HEI, for example, or that as an HEI partnership, what we could open the door to, green chemistry, materials engineering. And it's that fast tracking to research capability, which is why the British Council project particularly, that's now a 5-year, £500,000 programme. It's become a global programme with businesses that sound very like what you're talking about without giving you any specific illustration, with real economic growth to it. Quite extraordinary. I would never have imagined we would have been involved in that in a month of Sundays. So don't underestimate who you're working with, and open up the opportunity to understand better how they read you, I think would be my advice.
I think we can finish on that one. I think we already heard next door the applause. Big hand of applause for Jane, Kathy and Bernard. Absolute pleasure. And I think it was indicated to me the drinks are ready. So feel free to have a drink now and relax and network and ask the panel lots of more questions if you're interested in creative clusters. Thank you so much. Thank you.